Hey, welcome. You ever read a news story and then see it reported somewhere else and it just feels totally different? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're going to pull apart a major conflict story, not just to get the facts, but to see how the words themselves, the headlines, the quotes, are chosen to frame how we think. We'll be hitting this from a few different angles, and yeah, we'll even break down some key English vocabulary as we go.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we're going to look at the powerful words used to describe the military action. Then, we'll follow the money and see the economic shockwaves. After that, we need to talk about the very real human cost. Then, we'll get into the tricky part. Is there even an endgame here? And finally, we'll tie it all together to see why paying attention to this language makes you a much smarter news consumer.
It all kicks off with language just like this. This is a real headline from BBC News. Notice the words, most intense day of bombing. That's not just a description, right? It's designed to make you feel the urgency, the crisis. It's dramatic, and that framing is our entry point.
And that feeling of intensity brings us right to our first section. News reports didn't just call it an attack, they called it a terrifying onslaught. So let's dig into that and see what that language is really doing.
Okay, so here's our first key vocabulary word, onslaught. Now, if you're learning English, this is a fantastic word to know because it is so much more powerful than just attack. An onslaught is relentless, it's overwhelming, it's destructive. It's a word specifically chosen to paint a picture of being completely overrun.
And here we see it in action, pulled right from the source material. Terrifying onslaught. That phrase does more than just state a fact. It's telling a story. It immediately puts you in the shoes of the people on the ground, making you feel that chaos and fear. And if you're wondering just how big this onslaught really was, well, get a load of this number. Over 5,000 military strikes. This wasn't some small, isolated event. This was a massive, sustained campaign. And that number is used to justify using a word as powerful as onslaught.
So what was the official reason for all this? Well, the stated goals for what was called Operation Epic Fury were, very clear, very concrete. Things like destroying missile stockpiles, taking out the Navy, stopping any nuclear weapons development, and dealing with so-called proxies. These are all very tangible military goals. Now, I want you to file those away, because we're going to see how they clash with something else a little later.
Of course, the effects of a war never just stay on the battlefield. And that brings us to our second piece of the puzzle, the economic shockwave. This is where we see how a conflict thousands of miles away can send ripples right into your daily life, right into your wallet.
So let's just ask the big question. How does all this actually connect back to you? Well, a lot of the time, the answer is the economy. And more specifically, the flow of something the whole world runs on, oil.
And this brings us to another really important English phrase, price gouging. Now, listen to that phrase. It doesn't sound neutral, does it? It's not just a price increase. Gouging is an accusation. It implies someone is being greedy, that they're unfairly taking advantage of a bad situation. The phrase itself is loaded with moral judgment.
And to see what this looks like in the real world, the source material points to the UK, where this huge gap opened up. Some gas stations were charging way more than others. And it's that kind of difference that makes people cry foul and use a loaded term like price gouging.
And that pressure at the pump, it has a knock-on effect. Look at this. The UK had to actually revise its official inflation forecast, bumping it up a whole percentage point. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but believe me, that 1% affects everything from the interest on your loans to the price of your groceries. It's a big deal.
But why? Why does a regional fight cause this global panic? It all comes down to this one little sliver of water, the Strait of Hormuz. A mind-boggling 20% of the entire world's oil supply has to pass through there. So any threat to that single choke point, even just the hint of a threat, sends the global markets into a complete tailspin. And you feel that every single time you go to fill up your car. So, we've talked military language and we've talked economics. But behind all of that, behind the data and the strategy, there's always the human cost. And in this section, we need to look at the numbers, but more importantly, we need to hear the stories that give those numbers a voice.
And the numbers, they're just grim. The reports document over 1,200 people killed, and that includes almost 200 children. And of course, there's a cost for the attackers too, with 140 U.S. military members injured and 7 killed. Every single one of these numbers is a life, a family, a story. And it goes way beyond just the casualties. The UN estimates that 100,000 people have lost their homes, they've been displaced. That's a city's worth of people forced to flee. It's a massive humanitarian crisis.
You know, numbers on a screen can start to feel a little abstract after a while, but a personal story, that makes it real. This quote from a refugee, "We felt like we are dying, a full building shattered." That right there, that's the human reality behind a word like onslaught. That's the voice that turns a statistic back into a person.
All of this immense suffering, it forces us to ask a really tough question. What is this all for? What is the point? And that leads us to this really complicated idea of a war that might not have a clear endgame. We're going to compare those clear military aims we talked about earlier with the much, much fuzzier political goals.
And this right here is where the whole strategy starts to fall apart. Look at this. On one side, you've got these super clear military targets. Destroy this, neutralize that. But on the other side, the political goals are just a bunch of question marks. Is it about regime change? Forcing a surrender? Nobody seems to have a clear answer. The reports say no specific political goal was ever really stated out loud. And that lack of a clear political goal becomes a huge problem when you're up against an opponent that is described with another key vocabulary word, resilient. To be resilient means you can take a hit, you can absorb the pressure, and you can bounce back. And in this case, it means the Iranian regime wasn't collapsing like some people might have expected.
And this quote, it explains everything. Because the regime is proving to be so resilient, and because the economic pain, those high gas prices, are starting to be felt back home by voters, the whole strategy has to shift. It stops being about winning some vague political victory and starts being about crafting a victory narrative. Basically, finding a way to declare success based on those military goals we talked about, and then get out.
Okay, so we've looked at this thing from the military angle, the economic angle, the human angle, and the political one. For our final section, let's bring it all home and answer the big question. Why does any of this language actually matter?
What we've really done here is put together a kind of toolkit that you can use every single day. It's about training your brain to perk up when you hear those big, powerful words like onslaught. To not just accept numbers, but to ask, what story are these numbers trying to tell me? To hear the accusation in a term like price gouging, and to always be on the lookout for a mismatch between what the military is doing and what the politicians say they want. All while never, ever forgetting to listen for those human voices that get caught in the middle.
So I'll just leave you with this. The next time you're reading an article or watching a report, ask yourself this one simple question. Am I just getting the facts here, or am I being told a story? And if it is a story, what story are the words trying to sell me?
喜欢这种学习方式，欢迎订阅我的频道，让我们一起用下一个10分钟，把商业英文变简单。